I'm going to start with my mother's, how my mother got here. Her name was Beatrice Madrigal O'Brien. And it's interesting because she was named after her mother. So her mother's name was also Beatrice Madrigal O'Brien. But the story goes that Patrick O'Brien, who was a member of the Anglican Church in a small town in Ireland close to Limerick, left to go to New York City. And I think that was in the 1800s. It was because of the potato famine. And so he went right to New York City and settled there. He married to a Martha Harper, and they had 6 children, one being Thomas O'Brien, born in 1871. So Thomas would be my grandfather. And Thomas met his wife, Beatrice Madrigal. That's where Spanish came in, the Madrigal. She married a she came from the Madrigal family. And they were born in an Episcopal church. And there's so much differentiation between the Catholic and the Anglican. So they kind of all stayed in the Anglican church, which is sort of like Episcopal. So there was a story about when he saw her, my grandfather saw my grandmother, they were in the church, and he said, "I'm going to marry that woman." And he did, but he was 17 years older than her. So that couple would become my grandparents. And their first child was Beatrice Madrigal O'Brien. And she was married in New York City in 1911. Thomas, her father, was a salesman, and he had traveled to England to sell American bicycles. I think had heard he'd also gone to France. And he had a hotel in Ohio. We always kind of wondered what he did because he had so many different things he was doing. But one thing he did do is he authored a book about salesmanship. And it attracted somebody at the Olds Motor Works in Lansing. And they got a hold of him and they hired him to be their sales manager. And so that was his reason for coming to Lansing. And when they moved to Lansing, they also brought my grandmother's mother, Madrigal. And she was very busy all the time cooking and taking care of things and making sort of like an extra mother for the kids. And they lived at 623 West Ottawa, right where we are today, almost. And then mother had the 2 brothers, Thomas and William, and one sister, Martha. Thomas became the advertising agency in Lansing. And William, he wanted to be an actor, and so he went to New York City, and he was kind of our star. And he ended up being a stage manager for Broadway plays. And it was funny because he just did Funny Girl. He did Funny Girl, and we just had that at Wharton. And he did that with Barbra Streisand, and he used to tell us wild stories about how hard she was to work with and everything. And then when he did 42nd Street with Gower Champion, maybe was the producer of that, and there's a dog in that play. And so that play was moving on to L.A. from New York, and so they moved Bill with the dog and gave him the dog. And then he ended up just staying in L.A. because it was so nice there, and they had a lot of Broadway plays for him to do. I wrote that the house had been torn down for the Capitol complex. Anyway, they joined St. Paul's, so they were not far away from here. And they were active members. They just walked to church, and my grandmother was on the altar guild, and they did all those kinds of things. And my mom growing up, once I asked her a little bit about what she liked best about growing up in downtown Lansing, and she said, well, her favorite was the circus. When the circus came to town, they came on a train, and all the kids would go down to the train station or line up along Michigan Avenue and watch the performers, all the animals, and then they'd get to go to the circus. She loved school. She loved all her schools. Latin was her favorite subject. And then she enrolled at Michigan State College when she was 16, and she took the trolley that ran down Michigan Avenue to campus. They shopped for groceries at Arbaugh's department store on Washington Avenue. And then she would meet her husband-to-be, Dick Hermann, the handsome young man whose family had immigrated from Germany to start a bespoke merchant tailoring business. The last job her father had, Thomas O'Brien, he had been elected mayor of Lansing, but unfortunately he died before taking office. So that's pretty much what I had about them.
Tell us about the Hermann side of the family.
Yes, then there's the Hermann side. I guess I'm mostly thinking about the Hermann house and kind of the symbol of the Hermann family. And that house came about because of John T. Hermann. So John T. Hermann came to Lansing from Hessen, Darmstadt. It's below Frankfurt on the map. But then it was sort of its own little principality. And he wanted to leave because he wanted to avoid conscription into the Prussian army. And they were sort of taking over that area where he lived. And they had very strict rules for every person to do like 6 years of military service. And he wanted to get out of there. And a friend of his said, you should go to Lansing, Michigan, because you can shoot a deer from your porch. And so he thought that sounded really good. And he did come to check it out before he brought his wife and 2 children. And so he came, and there were a lot of tailoring shops in Lansing. And he brought his wife, Catherine, and his sons, Henry and Christian. So both of Henry and Christian went into the tailoring business with him. And then when he died, they sort of took over, and my father, too, was in with them. So, but it's interesting because he spent 6 years working in a tailoring shop in Lansing to make the money to buy his own building and start his own business. And so he started his own shop in 1878, and he brought about 35 tailors or more to come and work in I can't remember if the building was 3 stories or 4 stories, but it was right next to the Bank of Lansing. And I remember part of the Bank of Lansing's property was on their property. And so that money that the Bank of Lansing paid, he saved all that money for his daughters because he said they might need it sometime, or if they wanted it, needed money. So he said it was always kind of complicated. And also I remember the tailors, they all had different jobs. Like he was a pants maker, he was a cutter, he was a sewer or whatever. But you would see these people like cross-legged on top of the tables, just like you'd see in a fairy tale. And that's sort of the way they worked. And then they had these dumb waiters that would like take the fabric and stuff that would go up to another floor, so they didn't have to keep going up and down floors. And then the lower level was very beautiful. When you walked into the store, it was all mahogany shelves and cupboards that went all around the main part, and big round mahogany tables where they could roll the fabric out. And like when my brothers were at Sexton in high school, before they went to school, they would go to the store and they went, and my dad was ahead of it then, and they would roll out the fabrics. They knew just how to do that. And then after school or in the evening, they'd go back and roll them back up. And I've talked to a lot of people in Lansing who did that. I'm trying to think of a couple of them, but that did that. He would hire high school kids, and they'd learn a lot about taking care of things. And then everything was very beautiful, with beautiful mirrors in mahogany trim. And Dave O'Leary's mother was his secretary. He has the paint store in Lansing. So she was wonderful and just like part of the family. So the English Tudor house was built in 1893. There was a big barn behind it then, and there was room for horses and a carriage, and it was fenced in, and I can remember playing back there, and Christian, and Agnes was his wife. They had those hot dogs, the little dachshunds, high knee, and be running around. And then my aunt had a skunk for a pet, and it had been smelled so that it couldn't cause any problems. But I remember playing with it in the yard. And she was one of the founders, sort of, and big supporter of matinee musicale. So she was very musical. She did music lessons, piano lessons for people. She was a soprano. She sang in a lot of events. And then she had a lot of events at that house and meetings, and was a very lovely woman, wore a lot of blue. She liked blue. And inside the house, there's a really cute little room. It's kind of like a phone booth that I remember playing in there. And I think that's where they had their telephone. And it was just a wonderful big old kitchen and all the big old furniture that when they remodeled it, they changed that. They took out that kitchen and put in like a modern kitchen. But I guess they had to do that because it was a conference center. So after John Theodore Herrmann died in 1898, his sons, Henry and Charles, took over the business. Charles got the house, but not for very long. And we don't know what happened because he's kind of gone. All of a sudden, he went to Minnesota and started his own business. So then it was really my father's Uncle Chris. I always called him Uncle Chris. And so Christian and Agnes lived in that house, and then Christian died and Agnes continued to stay there. She didn't drive, and my dad did a lot of driving for her and picking her up and taking her places. And she had a lot of other relatives, too, on her side of the family, the Bouks. And so she continued to stay there. And then when she died, Christian got the house. That was Chris's son. And Christian did not go into the family business. He was a doctor in California. And his specialty was myasthenia gravis. and he was famous for studying that, and very brilliant man. And when he died, I think he gave all his money to that hospital, UCLA, and but he was also the largest donor they've ever had for LCC. I mean, he still cared about Lansing and wanting it to be better, and always when he came home, he'd check out the house, and that's why he sold it to LCC, because he thought they'd keep it. He was afraid that somebody would just tear it down, and he had no interest in staying there. So that was very nice for the family, too. And now it's the LCC's president's house, which is great, too. So when my dad took over, he was just there by himself. He had, Chris was gone. He was the main salesman, and he did a lot of traveling. He would get a hotel room downtown Detroit for maybe 2 days, and then he had customers that would come for their fittings, and so they didn't have to drive to Lansing. And he was very active in the community, and all that family was. He was president of the school board. He was president of Rotary. And even like his father, when they, if they had to travel, like to Grand Rapids or something for a fitting, they would always plan it on a day when there was a Rotary meeting, so they wouldn't miss any of their Rotary. And I remember people used to ask my dad to run for mayor because he was so active in the community. In 1958, when Kozacek's store was booming, and there were more stores like them that were able to make really fine quality, ready-made clothing, John Hermann's Sons, after 80 years of business, was closed, and my father began a career in commercial real estate. So he had an office down on Capitol Avenue, and he knew a lot of people. So he did, I know he worked with Mr. Meyer a long time on special things. Now we get into John Herrmann. John Herrmann did not go into the tailoring business, but he had a career as a writer. And I've told you all about the business stuff, but that whole family was so into boats. If they didn't have a boat, they'd find a boat. Dorothy, the daughter, bought a boat, and they kept it in Macatawa. Then the boys would take her, and they'd go on a picnic for the day. And my grandmother bought a cottage on Walloon Lake, a great big old cottage. Didn't have electricity or anything, and but it had a little bunky room, like another thing built onto it, with lots of beds, so all the kids could come. And then they would write each other these letters, which I do have some of, about Ursula Hemingway and how they took her out at the boat and how she was the princess. And there was this whole thing going on in St. Joe with some kind of like this man had come, and it was sort of like his own religion. And I can't remember what they called him. But anyway, they pretend they were him, and that they had their kingdom out there on Walloon Lake. And a lot of that they'd write down and tell each other about. And then my grandparents wanted easier lifestyle than the rough places. So they bought a cottage in Bayview. But the main thing was the Hemingway connection, which I think kind of encouraged John to be, more involved in different things with his writing. Oh my gosh, these are adventures. There was lots of talk of sailing and fishing and Hemingway and Herman suits. Because my grandfather had the tailoring business in Lansing, his boys were very well clothed. John's suit story begins when John would pass on to Ernest Hemingway his slightly used suits when his father had sent him a new one. In a letter, he thanks him, or a letter of thanks, Hem writes, "The suit is fine and it fits perfectly, except for the length of the trousers that a tailor could fix in an hour. It is damned handsome suit, thanks." And in another he writes, "It's damn fine to know that your father and brothers will clothe us all from now on. I won't need another one now until fall. Break in something natty in a Clark blue for October wear. Best to you always, Hem." When John's dad had sent him $1,000 check, only to find out that John was living with Josephine Herbst out of wedlock, he wrote that the check had been canceled due to John's living circumstances. Yet he added a P.S. that he had sent him a new summer suit. So I don't know. They had the family kind of straight-laced thinking, and then they had these boys that were all kind of wild and going off in different ways. And my dad wrote that while he loved the trout in Torch Lake, they could catch bullheads a block from where they lived on North Washington Avenue. He writes, "They were ugly, with horns sticking out and sharp points. My older brother John would gut them and pull the black skin off and then roll them in flour and salt them and fry them in lard to a crisp brown. And boy, they were dandy." So anyway, they go on, they talk a lot about the girls from Oak Park, the Hemingway girls, going to the cabaret in Harbor Springs, the Jewelette's that used to be kind of a dance hall, Raleigh Stebbins, Roaring Brook. It said during the Depression, the boys bought a 30-foot yawl from one of their sister's friends, which sailed to Wisconsin to Holland, Michigan. They kept it there on weekends. My dad writes, they would go to Affelt's grocery store in North Lansing, get liquor and groceries, charge them to their dad's account, and then go to Holland and sail all weekend. The love of sailing is what drove John's enlistment in the Coast Guard and his sailing all over the country, as well as in Key West with Ernest Hemingway. Yeah, so John went to Paris and kind of got in with Josephine Herbst, whom he married, who was a very liberal thinking woman, writer. And Gertrude Stein was one of her very good friends. And so John hung out with that crowd, and they helped him. They'd read his books, they'd read things he'd written and give him ideas. And Hemingway, I remember once in a letter, John had written to Hemingway and said he needed money so badly. And Hemingway said, "I don't have any money, but I'll send you a story and you can sell it." So they did like short stories that they would kind of pass around. Or I know that he wanted to help farmers and he wanted to help people. And so he got, kind of involved with politics that way. But I guess the most crushing thing would be when he brought the book, was it What Happens? He had it published in Paris, and then when he went to bring it back to the United States, they blocked it and said it was salacious and against the rules of moral conduct or whatever, because I haven't read much about that. But so if you've read the book, it's just sort of about a coming of age of a young man, nothing that we would blink an eye at. But I almost wonder if somebody was trying to get at him for, something that, but I know his parents were very upset. And there was a letter where the mother had written that the Hemingway, she was friends with Mrs. Hemingway, and everybody was talking about him and how he was bad and all that. And so that was probably hard for him too.